everybody. This is Nicole Sanchez from MAPC. Thank you for calling in today. We're going to talk about the SolSmart program and some solar resources that we have and some upcoming resources that you can tune into. So if you haven't worked with us before, a little bit about us. MAPC is the regional planning agency. We work with 101 cities and towns in the greater Boston area. Our clean energy team specifically, that's the team that I'm on, we work on both regional and local individual projects with communities. We work on energy projects, group procurements, local energy action programs, including our Net Zero to 101 initiative, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And we also provide technical assistance on a number of different energy efficiency measures. So today I wanted to talk about some of the solar resources and work that MAPC does, about the SolSmart program and what we have done already with that program and some opportunities to get involved in the future. And then some of the zoning and permitting work that we did in the first round of the program and the technical assistance that we have ongoing in those areas. And then we'll end with some question and answers. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please type them into the chat or the Q&A. And we'll also be recording this webinar so that you can have this as a resource later. So one of the initiatives that we've started up this year is the 0 to 101, and this is our net zero planning initiative. And so a lot of the resources that we put together and the technical assistance that we provide falls under different areas of net zero planning. So if you want to see all of these net zero resources together, you can go to our website to Net Zero. We've taken a holistic planning approach to net zero. So what that means is that we're working with a number of different departments within MAPC. We're thinking about the health impacts of net zero, and we're giving a lot of different options to communities in our resources and trying to come up with resources that can help you plan for your specific city or town's needs. So as part of this process, we have 4 steps of the process cycle. So we have recruiting support from your community, pursuing a commitment, prioritizing holistic planning, and gathering necessary information. So these 4 steps are continually taking throughout the process. There isn't necessarily an order to them, so you might go through each of these steps several times throughout your net zero planning process. And we don't want to limit communities to one definition of net zero. So there are a lot of different sectors that a community might want to focus on with their energy efficiency or their carbon reduction goals. So we're trying to provide opportunities to set a target and decide what each community would like to focus on. And so here are some of the different sectors of net zero planning that SolSmart and being thoughtful about your solar processes can touch. And so some of the resources we're going to be coming out with soon for net zero is our planning playbook, and that will be examples of different measures that communities can take within these specific sectors to promote their net zero targets. So let's talk about some of the solar work that MAPC is already working on and some of our upcoming events. So we have the RSI, which is our Regional Solar Initiative, and for that we have some exciting upcoming workshops on solar. And so these are the topics that we're going to be pursuing this year. So we want to provide some resources on procurement vehicles for solar and storage, and also adding storage to existing solar systems, some solar zoning resources, and then in the fall we wanted to look at solar training for fire and emergency staff, some resources on solar carports and how to implement those. We know that the SMART incentive is on the horizon, and we want to put out a lot of resources and opportunities to have discussions about how the SMART incentive will look in municipal solar. And then we also want to put together some resources on low to moderate income and multifamily solar and how to go about promoting those systems. So also under the Regional Solar Initiative, we have an opportunity for all of our communities, if they want to subscribe for technical assistance through CADMIS, which is our selected vendor through this initiative. So you can look at our Clean Energy newsletter for that opportunity, or you can contact me. And this list is not all-encompassing, so if there's anything under solar and municipal solar that you want to learn more about, we're open to suggestions for topics that we should be building resources out on. So along with the Regional Solar Initiative, we're also doing some more in-depth code work. And so the International Energy Conservation Code has a code cycle that's for their 2021 code. So we're going to be doing a lot of outreach for that code because municipalities have an opportunity to vote on what the new iteration of that code looks like. So we'll be doing some trainings and resources on understanding the different aspects of that code and how communities can get involved. So definitely look out for that. Related to some of the SolSmart initiatives and solar permitting work, we're going to be launching a newsletter for code officials so that we can provide resources on some of the technology we already work with our energy managers to get our code officials on board and up to date with what that technology looks like, how to do inspections for solar, for air source heat pumps. So that's a good newsletter to get in on, and if you'd like to sign up for that, let me know as well. We recently just completed a solar thermal, our part of the solar thermal challenge, where we worked with MAPC and Meister Consultants Group, and for that we did a municipal pilot procurement for solar thermal with Chelsea and Winthrop. And we've put together a bunch of resources on solar thermal procurements that are available on our website. So we put together a solar thermal incentives calculator, which you can use for your procurement so that your vendors and your potential vendors are on the same page as you with how they're calculating those incentives when they're submitting a bid. It makes it easier to compare apples to apples. We also have some procurement templates that you can use for a feasibility study procurement and for an invitation for bids for installation. And through all of our research for that program, we really looked at two main incentives that municipalities can take advantage of for solar thermal systems. And I really like this program because it diversified the resources that we can provide to municipalities. Sometimes solar PV doesn't make as much sense as solar thermal. It really depends on the context of the siting. So we really got to gain some more resources and knowledge base on that line between solar thermal and solar PV. So one of the incentives that opportunities that we have right now is MAPC rebate. There's a rebate for feasibility studies for up to $5,000, and there's also a rebate for installation, and this has a couple different ways to calculate it. For smaller commercial systems, which is what the majority of the sites that we look at for municipal solar thermal would fall under, this is that equation, and this is also in our incentive calculator. And the other opportunity to be aware of is alternate energy credits, or AICs. And so these are good for both your residents and for municipalities to be aware of. So these are credits that get calculated, again, with, you can use a couple different formulas depending on what size the system is. And you, similar to the way that SRECs work, you receive credits based on your production. And another opportunity that I want to make sure everyone's aware of is that MAPC has been putting together some trainings for solar inspectors. I attended one of these, and it was they did a really thorough job of going through what the solar permitting and inspection process could look like and talking through some of the issues that go along the way. It was very interactive. And so through our Clean Energy newsletter, we've been trying to make sure everyone's aware of these events, and these are some trainings that have already happened. They're trying to pair these with solarized communities, with new solarized communities, but there are other opportunities, and there will be more opportunities for code officials and inspectors to be trained on solar PV and solar thermal technology. So that's part of the new newsletter, is that we want to raise awareness about these as they come up. So let's talk about the SolSmart process. So the whole idea of this SolSmart program is to reduce solar soft costs. So why are we looking at this? So solar soft costs are everything, all of the costs except for the hardware. So if you have, we pretty much have a fixed price for what the panel would be, or we don't have a lot of control over that aspect of cost, but what we do have control over as municipalities and communities are these soft costs. So how much will our residents pay for their installer to go through the planning and zoning process? What does permitting look like in interconnection? What types of financing are available to them? Are there consumer protection resources available? So this gives a good breakdown from U.S. Department of Energy's office on what makes up solar soft costs. And again, that's the whole idea behind SolSmart, is to address these solar soft costs and recognize communities that have taken steps to address these. So this program really overlaps well with green communities and solarized communities. If you have pursued either of those or both of those, you probably already have accomplished many of the criteria, and I'll talk about in a little bit more detail which criteria you might want to pursue if you would like to pursue SolSmart designation. And so here's what the process looks like for application and designation. We did one round with a SolSmart advisor with 7 of our communities in the first round, the last spring, and all of those communities got designated. And so I'll talk a little bit more about what work we did specifically with those communities. There is an opportunity to get a SolSmart advisor for this next upcoming round, which would be in the fall. And so we've applied for that with some of our North Shore communities. So we'll find out soon if we have gotten the SolSmart advisor for the fall. And if we do get the SolSmart advisor, then we'll have more opportunities for our surrounding communities to tie in with that program and to work with a SolSmart advisor. And what that looks like, that iteration of the program is having hands-on technical assistance with achieving designation, and each community sets their specific goals and targets of what they want to get out of the program and in their solar statement, which I'll talk about in a second. So there are other iterations of the program as well, though. You can apply for designation without a SolSmart advisor, and that's something that we can help you with and have a lot of experience with. And that could be a good way to get recognition for the work you're already doing. The other big benefit of this program is connecting with national best practices and resources. So the training that MAPC has been doing with solarized communities, the project partners for that are also project partners with SolSmart. And we did some permitting and inspection trainings through our first SolSmart advisor round. And if we get a SolSmart advisor for the fall, we'll also be planning some regional events and trainings along with that as well. So the application process looks like involves two things. So it's filling out an online application or a paper version of that application, which is going through all of the different criteria and saying what you've already done, what you're interested in doing, what you're not interested in doing. And then also writing a solar statement, which is a short one-page letter about what goals you'd like to accomplish as a community. And that can be submitted online through this portal on solsmart.org. So here are some communities that have already gotten designated in Massachusetts. So we worked with Somerville, Natick, Winthrop, Chelsea, Boston, and Cambridge directly. And Tyngsboro worked with a SolSmart advisor in this past round, and Dartmouth worked on this on their own. And then here's an idea of what it takes to get each level of designation. So there's bronze, silver, and gold. If you're working with a SolSmart advisor, you want to aim to at least get to the bronze level of designation. These are the prerequisites for each level of designation. And then on top of this, you can choose which criteria you'd like to pursue. So there's a lot of flexibility in this program. So to achieve bronze, you need to have that solar statement that we talked about. You want to put together and post a permitting checklist. And this is something that can be really helpful for community, whether or not you want to pursue designation. Putting together this solar permitting checklist gives you a map of what your permitting process looks like. And that can be helpful internally to just know where all that documentation is, what documentation you need, and to communicate with installers what you would like them to submit. And then the other requirement is this zoning review for bronze. That's also something that we think is really helpful for communities, whether or not you are pursuing SolSmart designation. And then if you want to go further and get to silver, the big prerequisite there is to allow accessory use solar PV by right in all major zones. So that, for a lot of communities, involves an actual zoning bylaw change. So we'll talk about what that involves, and then this I-1 criteria, which is providing training of inspection and permitting staff on solar PV. That's also something that we think is a real value add to community. And then to achieve the highest level, gold, you want to be able to show that your average permitting turnaround time for solar is under 3 days. So an ambitious goal, but definitely achievable. So here's a list of the different criteria categories that we have, and this also gives you an idea of how the resources are organized. And I think a good idea to, if you're interested in looking at some of the best practices on solar permitting and zoning, is to go to the SolSmart website and look at some of the resources that they have under these different areas. So some of the best practices they have up on their website. This is also the list that you want to go through if you're considering filling out an application. So We have permitting, planning and zoning, and inspection. There's a lot of overlap between permitting and inspection. We have solar rights, which is where we have some best practices around consumer protection. Utility engagement, we worked on that a little bit with our communities in the first round of SolSmart Advisor. Community engagement, that a lot of those criteria are things that if you've done a solarized campaign, you probably have already qualified for. And then finance, which is an interesting category because there's a lot of flexibility in what you could do there, and we've seen some communities come up with really creative ways to make some changes in their community in that area. And for each of these categories, if you've done something that you think is not on the list but is helpful to reducing solar soft costs, you can make a case for making your own unique criteria, which I think is pretty cool. So let's talk about some of the resources that we have out of the first round of this program and some of the areas that we can provide technical assistance. So here are some of the things we worked on in the zoning category for this first round and some of the things that we're still working on. So again, we did the zoning reviews for all 7 communities. That's something that would be one of the first things we would work with on a community, because this process is to see what the zoning bylaws look like already. Do they mention solar? Where could they mention solar? Where would it make sense for solar to be in the bylaws in line with community goals? So this isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. It's very tailored to each community. Something else interesting that we worked on were historic district guidelines and some research on that. And we drafted some solar by right bylaws for communities that were interested in pursuing it. We've also been working on a database of zoning, sample zoning language on solar from MAPC communities, because we know that having examples of language that other communities are using can make it a lot easier to pick the language that you would want to consider for your own bylaws. So one question that we got a lot through this process is, why should we put solar as a by right use into our zoning in Massachusetts when we have this 40A requirement already that no bylaws should unreasonably regulate installation of solar? So we have 40A to say, you know, don't unreasonably regulate this, but we don't have, in a lot of communities, we don't have solar mentioned in the definitions and in the bylaws to give a good example of what this looks like in practice. So actually putting solar in your definition, putting it into your use chart gives a better idea of, to your residents and developers, what that process looks like for different types of systems. So it really clarifies what that process would be for, say, a residential roof mount versus a commercial ground mount. This is also a good way to just get your zoning process in line with your permitting process, because the back and forth in the zoning adoption process between the ISD and your zoning board will really help foster that communication. And we recognize that zoning changes are, for a lot of communities, a long time commitment. So for this program, and if we do this program in the fall, this is something that we would be looking at right at the beginning. And this is also something we can provide technical assistance with communities, whether or not you're looking at SolSmart in particular. And Massachusetts has a model zoning guideline for solar, and I put this chart together to show what these definitions look like in hierarchy. So I think it's helpful to dive a little bit deeper into the model of zoning and think about what definitions we want to pull from that for which community. It's worth going beyond copying and pasting the language and really being thoughtful about what types of solar projects you think would be viable in your community and which types of systems you would like to see more of. So Natick, for instance, was looking at some solar parking canopies and really wanted to define those projects in their zoning bylaws so that as those projects that they were expecting to came up, they would have a thorough system to know what to look for in the zoning reviews. And then there's a criteria that's specific about historic district guidelines, and a lot of the communities we worked with in the first round were really interested in thinking about what this could look like for their municipalities. And because this process can be pretty time-consuming for residents and for developers, and it can be hard to know what to look for in this historic design review for solar if you don't have a guideline to give one system for this process. So thinking through this was really helpful for some communities. Something that we did was look through previous decisions for solar in historic districts to see if we could see any patterns in how they were getting approved or recommended for further review. And we also looked at the Secretary of the Interior's guidelines for solar in historic districts to see what those best practices were for where solar could fit and into historic structures and buildings, and where we would want to avoid installing them. So in Natick, we went one step further and looked at this in an actual study. So we looked at land assessors data and Google Sunroof tool to see which historic homes would be viable to install solar on, and we wanted to give ourselves an experiment to test out if we put in certain requirements, how many homes would still be able to install, to see what that impact would be. So something interesting that came out of this was the pretty dramatic difference between a 2-foot setback and a 4-foot setback. It was really interesting to see how the amount of area available on the roof really got reduced by what seems like on paper at first just a small increase in the setback. And again, something we thought was really important was looking at different examples of what solar zoning language looks like in our communities already. And here are some communities that we looked at for different language. So we looked for height restrictions, dimensional regulations, if there were some passive solar regulations, and if there were existing historic district guidelines. Okay, and then the other major category of work that falls under SolSmart and that we have been putting together resources relating to is the inspection and permitting work. So these solar permitting checklists, again, we do with all communities because that was a prerequisite for bronze, but this is also the most helpful place to get started with mapping out what that process already looks like in the community and seeing if we have everybody on the same page. We also did a regional training with Bill Brooks, who's a code official who's been working specifically on the electric code and introduced the rapid shutdown requirement to the last iteration of the electric code. and we did a training on what streamlined solar permitting would look like and whether or not we could implement that with our communities. And then we did a training in Chelsea that was a joint training both with our inspectional services staff and with our planning and zoning staff. And that was a really great way to get that communication between the two departments on what this overall process would look like for solar permitting and the different pathways that we wanted different projects to take. I think one of the most important outcomes of this work are some consumer protection resources. That's something that we really try to make sure is front and foremost in resources that communities provide to their residents. We wanted to make sure that throughout this process, residents know what's going on with their developer, have a good idea of what to expect of the solar permitting process, and what to expect from their installation process. But also developed ISD resource guide, so we have a lot of links to resources that inspectors and permitting professionals can look to have some more training and build their knowledge base on solar permitting specifically, and also some links to resources that they could share for consumer protection as well. And then in Natick, we worked with their fire chief to start to put together resources for emergency professionals. That's something that we're really interested in working on further, both through the Regional Solar Initiative and through SolSmart. So as part of this work, we looked at what solar permitting in Massachusetts looks like already. DOR published this recommended model permitting process and structural review guides for PV in Massachusetts. And so they surveyed 25 different Massachusetts municipalities to see what they were already doing for permitting. So this gives you an idea of where communities are already at in our area and where we can focus through some of the measures lined out in SolSmart. So the average time needed for a permit review was 8 days, and so if you'll remember from the different levels of designation, to get to gold, we want to get that to an average of 3 days, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. The building permit fee was generally larger than the electric permit fee, and the majority of municipalities required 3 different inspections for PV permitting: a rough electrical inspection, a final electrical inspection, and a final structural inspection. So that was an interesting takeaway for me because we do have some flexibility in what those inspections look like for different sizes of systems, and we had a lot of good conversations about how we can make that process efficient. So there were also a variety of ways that communities were asking for submissions for their building and electrical permits for solar, and this is another area to gain criteria for SolSmart, is to move those submissions to email or to online, just to save this truck roll to submit the application for permit in the first place. We also looked at what the average permitting fees are. I think the biggest takeaway here is that, that for these smaller systems, Massachusetts has a smaller than average permitting fee than the country overall, but then for these larger systems, we have a higher permitting fee. That's pretty much where we want to be. I think the other piece to this puzzle is thinking about where your permitting fees are in comparison to your neighbors, because solar developers tend to look at that when they think about where they want to focus, especially for some bigger projects. So just something to consider as well. And then for the inspection process in Massachusetts, this is where there was a difference in what was expected for getting that final inspection for a solar permit. And the electrical rough inspection and the final structural inspection, those are inspections that we can either work on the timing of so that we have those combined with the final electrical inspection, or think about what documentation we might be able to require to replace that inspection in smaller systems. So we're not talking about taking away inspections for larger systems, but thinking about ways where if we really know what the system involves, we know what the plan looks like and is supposed to look like, that we can save ourselves a little bit of time and energy and a truck roll to do those inspections more efficiently. And the other area that we can think about this process is in the process for requesting the inspection in the first place. And all of these inspection processes are things that don't just affect solar, so thinking about how we go through these processes can help with different types of systems as well. So if usually you have to call in the day before for an inspection, that might be making it just the scheduling of projects in your community a little bit more difficult overall. But if you can have some sort of schedule where everyone knows when to be there, that's more in line with best practices. And then another big takeaway for us was thinking about what the average roof-mounted system looks like. So the idea of this is to define the system that we're most likely to be seeing for residential solar, knowing that we know what those components are and what this plan is supposed to look like. And having this ideal project that we know is the average project gives us a way to measure, like, if we're missing anything in the information that we're getting from the developer during the permitting process, and to say, this is a known entity. We know how to plan for this. We know how to permit this. If this system that's coming in as an application is meeting these criteria, we know that it's structurally sound. We know that it's electrically sound. So coming up with what those needs are in the design and then measuring against those. We also thought about what types of documentation to ask for solar permit applications. So something that we want to make sure we get is this site plan showing the panel layout, a 3-line diagram, and spec sheets for the equipment, so that we can really look at that particular site and make sure that the system design is what's being actually put on the roof or in the ground. And then we were thinking about how to get photos of the installation. We want to try to see the conduit run diagram and a structural engineer's letter. And this varies by community what you want to ask for. And then the solar ABC's streamlined permitting process is somewhere where you can look into this a little bit deeper. And this is something that Bill Brooks has been working on as well, and that he did a training on for us. And so this is the idea of developing an expedited permitting process for that known entity, the roof-mounted solar system that meets those certain criteria. And then again, consumer protection is something that we want to make sure we have in all of our resources, and that as we're thinking about our permitting and inspection process for solar, that we're making sure these are front and center. So came up with a short list of what we think residents should definitely know by the time of inspection. So they should know what their financing method is, who will own and broker their SRECs, and again, that's until we switch to the SMART incentive, that they need to add their solar system to their homeowner's insurance policy, how to turn the system off safely. They should know that the grid interconnected system will shut off when the power goes out, what warranties they have, and who will perform maintenance if anything goes wrong, whether they'd be reimbursed if they don't meet their production guarantee, how they can see their system's production, and to get a rough idea of what the timeline is for interconnection. That's the part of the process where we often have some frustration at the final step, because a lot of solar projects get to the interconnection step, and then you have to have your panels on your roof and wait for that interconnection letter to actually turn it on. That could be a big frustration point. So making sure that residents are prepared for that step is really important. And then in the first round of SolSmart, we did some, we worked on some communication with our investor-owned utilities. We also have a lot of communities that have municipal light plants, and so this gives an idea of just like what that interconnection process looks like for IOUs, but part of the best practices provided and some of the program partners do connect us with some resources to think through what the interconnection process for solar, for residential solar, could be for municipal light plants as well. And we're really interested in providing some more resources in this area. So some of the work that we did do was doing commenting on the Eversource rate case and the MMRC, and then also working on the single parcel rule. And this is an idea of just what the process looks like for interconnection with an IOU, and so and what those fees look like for different types of projects. Okay. So if you have any questions, please feel free to write those in. I'm happy to answer those now, and if you have questions after this webinar, you can email me at nsanchez, N-S-A-N-C-H-E-S, at mapc.org, or give me a call, and I'm happy to speak with you about any of these processes, about the SolSmart program or our other solar work. Okay, it seems like we don't have any questions at the moment, but I've put in some resources and links that you can go to learn a little bit more about the SolSmart program, about our solar work, and our net zero toolkit. I put in the link for the model zoning that DOER has for solar, and where you can find more information on the SMART program. And again, we'll be working on resources and more webinars on that specifically, so please stay tuned. And then how to look into doing a solar campaign or becoming a green community if you haven't pursued that yet. And we do also work with some communities on their green community application, so that's an opportunity to work with us as well. And if you have any questions or comments after this webinar, here's how to get in contact with me. Okay, so thank you very much for tuning in to the webinar today, and I'll be sending out the recording of this webinar to attendees so that you can have this as a resource later. Thanks very much.